In 1960, television, which had become a sensation throughout much of the world, had finally arrived in New Zealand. And this was a sort of camera that the New Zealand Broadcasting Service used to film those very early shows, the Marconi MKIV. Now, amongst TV cameras, this one is legendary. Marconi MKIVs were used by the United States Navy on location. They filmed such notable events as the Beatles' first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. And they filmed all those small moments which made early television so addictive. Let's take a closer look at it and work out what made it so important. Now, if we open up the side of a Mark IV, like this, you'll notice it looks very different to how a 1960s camera is supposed to look. As a matter of fact, there's no film in here. This camera sees electronically, not chemically, using something called an orthicon tube. In an orthicon tube, a chain of negatively charged electrons are fired through a vacuum by an electron gun. These electrons hit a light-sensitive surface just behind the camera's lens. The amount of light at each point of the surface changes the amount of electrons sent back to the far end of the tube, and these fluctuations are the signal the image is made from. The Mark IV only had one orthicon tube, so could only broadcast in black and white. Now, these orthicon tubes had a nasty habit of burning out, which is not what you wanted to happen during a live broadcast, which meant the camera technicians had to change them quickly and effectively. And the way they did that was by turning this crank, which raised the entire front of the camera, a bit like the bonnet half of a classic muscle car. And as the camera raises up, you can see the cover of the orthicon tube and the instructions to make sure the camera is off before changing it. Sort of like a torpedo tube on a submarine. There would have been multiple cameras going during a live broadcast, some on mobile wheeled stands like our one, some would have been on a cherry picker-like device swinging around the studio, which meant if one camera failed, there'd always be a backup ready to go. This is what a smaller, lighter video camera tube would have looked like. This one probably was about 10-15 years after the Marconi MKIV entered production. But you can still see they're pretty large, weighty things. And for lots of scenes, whether in the studio or on location, you needed to change the lens very quickly. And the Mark IV, like its predecessors, had a lens turret. So while looking on the back screen, you could turn different lenses into position, each for a different view, be it wide angle or telephoto. And some lenses are real monsters. Check this one out. This is a Taylor Hobson Veritel 3, a zoom lens which would have been used on location. Now, zooms were around for motion pictures and television long before they arrived for still photography. And no wonder, you probably needed a champion weightlifter on your film crew just to lug the zoom lenses about. This one would have been very expensive. The lens alone would have been thousands and thousands of dollars in today's money, and that's before you even started saving up for the camera. Our Marconi MKIV bears the logo of GTV9, one of Australia's very first television stations, which started broadcasting in Melbourne back in 1956. Now, there were many rumours about these early TV cameras, and a popular one in Australia was that they would see straight through any article of red clothing. Of course, it was all just rumour and speculation, but it caused a lot of panic at the time, especially if the camera was doing a live broadcast in the street. The real mystery here, though, is how a big, bulky Australian TV camera found its way to New Zealand. All the New Zealand Mark IVs had their own logos, like this one, which started an early Dunedin TV station in the 1960s. Needless to say, operating a camera like the Marconi Mark IV took a tremendous amount of skill. Between the heavy, bulky zoom lenses, the rather finicky orthicon tubes, and the sheer size and weight of the camera itself. If you knew how to run one and make excellent television, you were always in demand because there was a network of television channels springing up around the world who would need your services. So there must have been a little bit of trepidation amongst the operators when TV cameras got simpler. In fact, by 1970, the year this mighty Marconi Mark IV started being phased out, the core principles behind it, the television camera tubes, the zoom lenses, were condensed into machines like this, the 1970 Sony video recorder. The Sony video recorder may not have been a professional's camera, but it showed that more features are being fitted into smaller and smaller machines. Few wanted to keep an obsolete TV camera, so less than 24 Marconi Mark IVs survive out of over 950 made. MAVtech is honoured to look after one, and we hope you've enjoyed this video and learnt more about what happened behind the scenes of the early television studios. And as for the Sony video recorder, it paved the way towards the camcorders of the 1980s, but that's going to be a story for another video.